President.
The senator from Vermont.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me begin by wishing all Americans and my colleagues here in the Congress a very happy and peaceful holiday season. Unfortunately, for the people in Israel and Palestine, that will not be the case. This is not a peaceful season for them. In Gaza, millions of people will end the year under constant bombardment, exposed to the winter or living in tents, wondering where they will find their next meal or clean drinking water or the medical supplies they need. What is going on in Gaza right now is an unmitigated humanitarian disaster, and we must not look away from it. We all know that the current war was begun by Hamas and their brutal terrorist attack against Israel, which killed some 1,200 innocent men, women, and children and took more than 240 hostages. Hamas is a corrupt terrorist organization which, before and after their attack on October 7th, has made it clear that their goal is to destroy the state of Israel. There is no question in my mind that Israel has the right to defend itself and respond against the perpetrators of the October 7th attack. But while it is clear that Israel has the right to respond militarily against that terrorist attack, it is also clear that the Netanyahu right-wing extremist government is waging that war, that response, in a deeply reckless and immoral way. A just cause for war does not excuse atrocities in the conduct of that war, and that is precisely what we are seeing. Israel has the right to go to war against Hamas. It does not have the right to go to war against innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. Israel's reliance on widespread and indiscriminate bombardment, including the use of massive explosive ordnance in densely populated urban areas, is unconscionable. Mr. President, Israel's military campaign will be remembered among some of the darkest chapters of our modern history. Consider the toll thus far, and I hope that every member of Congress is prepared to consider the toll of what Israel is doing right now. As of today, nearly 20,000 people have been killed, 70% of whom are women and children. Let me repeat that. Nearly 20,000 people have been killed, 70% of whom are women and children, and more than 52,000 have been wounded since October 7th. More victims are likely trapped under the rubble. Further, 135 United Nations workers have been killed, as well as dozens of other aid workers. Mr. President, unbelievably, and it really is quite unbelievable, nearly 1.9 million people, that is more than 85% of the population in Gaza, have been driven from their homes. Can you imagine that? 85% of the people have been thrown out of their homes, and as we speak, They don't know where they are going. They don't know what their future is. They don't have enough food, water, medical supplies, or fuel. Despite sharing their locations with Israeli military forces, more than 100 United Nations facilities have been bombed. More than 100 UN facilities have been bombed, and the UN reports, and again an incredible fact, that over 60% of the housing units in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Can you imagine that? My state of Vermont has 600,000 people. That's half of the people who live, that's a third of the people who live in Gaza. And I'm just trying to think in my mind what it would look like if 60% of the housing units in Vermont were damaged or destroyed. But that is the case in Gaza right now. And Mr. President, let me put this in historical perspective. And what that historical perspective means, that the destruction in Gaza is now equivalent to that of Dresden, Germany, where 2 years of bombing by the United States Air Force and the British Air Force during World War II destroyed half of the homes in that city and killed about 25,000 people. Gaza has matched that in just 2 months, not 2 years, 2 months. This massive bombardment has made it impossible for the United Nations and other aid groups to provide basic necessities to the people in Gaza. As we speak, some 1.4 million people are sheltering in 155 overcrowded UN facilities. Can you imagine that? 1.4 million people are sheltering tonight in 155 grossly overcrowded UN facilities. There is little electricity, food, water, medicine, or fuel, and hundreds of thousands of children are going hungry tonight in Gaza. The shortage of clean water and adequate sanitation facilities is leading to disease. And Mr. President, we can't even begin to contemplate the lasting psychological damage being done to the children of Gaza. Can you imagine a 5-year-old, a 10-year-old looking around whether a bomb is going to be hitting him or her, wondering what kind of house, if any, they're ever going to return to, where they are going? Massive psychological damage being done to the people of Gaza, and especially the children. The United Nations senior humanitarian official said that he fears, quote, a breakdown in society, end quote, amid this desperation. Let's be frank. What we're talking about in Gaza now is not just a humanitarian cataclysm, but a mass atrocity. And Mr. President, what is important for every member of this body to understand, and every American to understand, is that all of this is being done with bombs and equipment provided by the United States of America and heavily subsidized by American taxpayers. We are paying for the carnage in Gaza right now. Our bombs, our ordnance. There is no denying that we are, as a nation, complicit in this carnage. The Israeli military has made extensive use of massive explosive munitions in its campaign, including 2,000-pound and 1,000-pound bombs and 155-millimeter artillery. These bombs and shells are manufactured here in America and supplied to Israel by the United States of America. The Wall Street Journal reports that the United States has provided at least 15,000 bombs and 57,000 artillery shells to Israel since October 7th, including more than 5,400 of the huge 2,000-pound bombs that can flatten entire neighborhoods. The Washington Post reports that in just 6 weeks after October 7th, Israel dropped more than 22,000 American-supplied bombs on Gaza. And CNN reports that U.S. intelligence believes 40 to 45% of the bombs Israel has used in Gaza have been unguided, dumb bombs. These munitions were provided with the full knowledge they would likely be used in Gaza, a densely populated urban area with a large civilian presence. Parts of Gaza are more densely populated than New York City. Mr. President, the press, human rights monitors, and U.S. officials have confirmed that U.S.-provided bombs have been used in attacks that have killed thousands of civilians. This campaign, I am sorry to say, very likely violates U.S. law and U.S. policy. And that is why I have introduced a privileged resolution under Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act. The resolution requests that the State Department provide information on any credible allegations of human rights violations in Gaza caused by indiscriminate or disproportionate military operations and the blanket denial of humanitarian access. It also requests a list of the arms provided to Israel since October 7th and a description of the steps taken to limit civilian risk caused by Israeli military actions. We will be voting on this resolution in January. And the basic question that we will be answering in that resolution is, do we support asking the State Department whether human rights violations may have been committed in the Israeli campaign in Gaza? That is not a tough question. And I hope that what we will see is a yes vote from most of my colleagues. This should not be controversial. If you believe, as I do, that this campaign has been indiscriminate, then it is our responsibility to get that question answered. If you believe Israel has done nothing wrong in Gaza, then you should want that information to support your belief. When we receive this information, we will then have a privileged vehicle to debate any necessary changes in U.S. security assistance to Israel. Mr. President, while I look forward to this debate, let me also mention that there are other things that we should be doing as well. The United States, President Biden, has urged Israel to change its tactics with regard to their indiscriminate bombing. The President, people in the State Department have asked Netanyahu over and over and over again. Unfortunately, the Netanyahu government has not listened and has not been terribly interested in our perspective, despite the fact that we are supplying the bombs that they are using, despite the fact that we have provided them with $3.5 billion every year for a long time in military aid. Instead, the Netanyahu government is continuing its military approach, which is both immoral and in violation of international law. And in my view, Mr. President, the United States must end our complicity in those actions. And to do so, we must make two critical changes in our policy. First, while it is appropriate to support defensive systems like Iron Dome to protect Israeli civilians against incoming rockets, it would be irresponsible to provide an additional $10.1 billion in military aid beyond those defensive systems as contained in the proposed supplemental foreign aid package. Bottom line, we should not be giving more money to a right-wing extremist government in Israel to conduct a horrific and immoral military campaign, which includes indiscriminate bombardment. Second, in my view, the United States should support efforts at the United Nations Security Council to end the bloodshed, such as a resolution expected tomorrow that would demand, and I quote, an urgent suspension of hostilities to allow safe and unhindered humanitarian access and for urgent steps toward a sustainable cessation of hostilities, end quote, as well as the unconditional release of all hostages. This should be something we strongly support. As you may recall, last week, the United States vetoed a resolution, and I think that was disappointing not just to me, but to many Americans. Mr. President, as we soon head home to our families, let us not forget the millions of people in desperate need, both here in the United States and around the world. In Gaza, there is a horrific situation we can and must do more to address. Cannot forget about it, cannot shove it under the rug. The time is now for the United States to stand up and do everything that we can to end this humanitarian disaster. Mr. President, thank you very much.
Objection?
Madam President, I wanted to say a few words about the $106 billion emergency foreign aid supplemental bill that may soon be coming before us. And I should be clear that there are a number of pieces of that bill that I strongly support, but in its present form, I do not think it serves the interests of the American people. Let me say a few words as to why. First, while I strongly support Ukraine's valiant efforts to defend itself against Putin's invasion and Israel's need to defend itself against incoming rocket and missile attacks, I am deeply concerned that this legislation has no investments to address the needs of working families in the United States, 60% of whom are living paycheck to paycheck. So let us be clear. Yes, there are enormous emergencies abroad, but there are also very serious emergencies in our own country, including the crises we face in childcare, in primary health care, housing, and in other needs. The American people do not want us to continue to ignore these issues. Secondly, at a time when Congress will likely soon pass a $900 billion defense bill, this supplemental bill includes tens of billions that should be covered as part of the base defense budget and handled through normal appropriations, not allocated as emergency spending. We can save tens of billions of dollars in this bill and dedicate that money to some of the horrendous domestic crises that we face. Thirdly, and maybe most importantly, Madam President, at a time when some 16,000 Palestinians have been killed in the last 2 months, 2/3 of whom are women and children, and tens of thousands more have been injured. At a time when 1.8 million people, Palestinians, have been displaced from their homes and are struggling every day, have been thrown out of their homes. They don't know where they're going. They are struggling to get food and water and medical supplies and fuel just to survive. And I want you to think about what's going on with the children, a lot of children in that country. What is going on psychically, them looking up in the sky, is a bomb going to fall? Where am I spending the night? How do I get food? That's what's going on there right now. And Madam President, at a time when over 250 people have been killed in the West Bank, I'm not talking about Gaza, I'm talking about the West Bank, since October 7th, and more than 1,000 Palestinians have been driven off of their land in the West Bank. No, in the midst of all of that, I do not believe we should be appropriating over $10 billion for the right-wing extremist Netanyahu government to continue its current military approach. What the Netanyahu government is doing is immoral, it is in violation of international law, and the United States should not be complicit in those actions. Madam President, we are all clear that Hamas, a corrupt terrorist organization, began this war with their barbaric attack against Israel on October 7th. Given that reality, Israel has a right to defend itself, but it does not have, in my view, the right to wage all-out war against innocent men, women, and children, Palestinians, who had nothing to do with the Hamas attack. Therefore, I believe it is appropriate for us to support defense systems that will protect Israeli citizens from incoming missile and rocket attacks. But I believe that it would be irresponsible for us to provide an additional $10.1 billion in unconditional military aid that will allow the Netanyahu government to continue its current offensive military approach. That approach has included indiscriminate bombing that has killed, as I mentioned before, 16,000 people, most of whom are civilians. And I want to make this point. All of us, many of us, I hope most of us, understand that what is going on in the Ukraine is horrendous. Putin, almost 2 years ago, attacked Ukraine. The result is massive destruction. Hundreds of thousands of young Russian soldiers are dead. Some 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers are dead. It is a disaster. But interestingly enough, according to the United Nations, about 10,000 civilians have been killed since Russia's unprovoked invasion in February 2022. 10,000 civilians killed in Ukraine in a terrible war in almost 2 years. 15,000 Palestinians killed in the Gaza area in 2 months. Israel's indiscriminate approach is, in my view, offensive to most Americans. It is in violation of U.S. and international law, and it undermines the prospects for lasting peace and security. Israel must dramatically change its approach to minimize civilian harm and lay out a wider political process that can secure lasting peace. And that must include a guarantee that displaced Palestinians will have the absolute right to return to their homes as Gaza rebuilds. It will include no long-term occupation or blockade of Gaza, an end to the killings of Palestinians in the West Bank, and a freeze on new settlements there, and perhaps most importantly, a commitment to broad peace talks to advance a new two-state solution in the wake of this war. Madam President, the Biden administration has appropriately, and I applaud them for this, been trying to get the Israelis to be more targeted in their approach, but there is little evidence that they have succeeded. Just today, airstrikes, Israeli airstrikes, hit 2 UN schools housing displaced people. Today, 2 UN schools housing displaced Palestinians. More than 900 Palestinians have been killed since Friday. Israeli evacuation orders are delivered with little notice to people with no electricity and limited communication services, most of whom have already been displaced, have already been traumatized, and already lack basic necessities. And then, even then, the bombing continues. So, Madam President, as we proceed on this supplemental bill, which has some very, very important issues, count me in 100% for the humanitarian that we support, that we need, not only in Gaza, but all over this world. Count me in for that. Count me in for serious discussions about how we improve border security. Count me in to help the people of Ukraine withstand Putin's terrible invasion. But do not count me in to give another $10 billion to a right-wing extremist government in Israel, by the way, whose prime minister now, I guess their trial for corruption is continuing. Don't count me in to support that $10 billion. And with that, I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum. Mr. President, the American people understand, whether they are Democrats, Republicans, or independents, that our health care system is broken, it is dysfunctional, it is failing. We spend almost twice as much per person on health care, an unsustainable $13,000 for every man, woman, and child, than any other country on earth, and yet the results of all of that spending are abysmal. While the insurance companies and the drug companies make hundreds of billions of dollars in profit, we have 85 million Americans who are uninsured or underinsured, and over 60,000 people who die every single year because they can't get to a doctor when they need to. In this country, despite our huge expenditures, we don't have enough doctors, nurses, dentists, pharmacists, or mental health specialists. And our life expectancy is far lower than most other countries, especially for working class and lower income Americans. Mr. President, in my view, and I think it's the view of most Americans, health care is a human right, not a privilege. And we need major reforms to our current system so that every man, woman, and child in this country gets the quality health care they need, regardless of their financial status. The responsibility for reforming our broken health care system rests with the administration, and it rests with many agencies of government, including HHS, CMS, the FDA, and the National Institute of Health, NIH, which plays a very important role in the development of new prescription drugs. Mr. President, while the 10 largest drug companies made over $112 billion in profits last year, and while they pay their CEOs exorbitant compensation packages, 1 out of 4 Americans cannot afford to pay for the medicine they need, and thousands of families face financial ruin as they pay outrageously high prices for the prescription drugs that keep them alive. Let's think about that for just 1 second. Millions of people in this country every year get sick. They go to the doctor, and the doctor writes out a prescription. And yet, because of the exorbitant price of prescription drugs in America, 1 out of 4 of those people cannot afford to fill that prescription. So what happens to those people? Well, they get sicker. Maybe they end up in an emergency room. Maybe they end up in a hospital. Maybe they die. How crazy is it that in the richest country in the history of the world, 25% of our people cannot afford to fill the prescriptions their doctors prescribe? But it is not just the high cost of prescription drugs that impact individuals. In the largest hospital in my state of Vermont, and I don't think it's terribly different elsewhere, the high cost of prescription drugs account for 20% of the overall budget of that hospital, and that drives insurance policies up. What we pay in the hospital impacts greatly the prices we pay for insurance. In other words, Mr. President, the outrageously high cost of prescription drugs in America is a crisis situation that must be addressed. It impacts everybody. Adding insult to injury, not only has the federal government not effectively regulated the price of prescription drugs, but the taxpayers of this country have, over the years, provided hundreds of billions of dollars in research and development into new prescription drugs that have provided enormous financial benefits to some of the most profitable drug companies in America. For example, in America today, the median cost of new cancer drugs has gone up by more than 300% over the past decade, even though 85% of the initial foundational cancer research is funded by U.S. taxpayers. In June, the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee, which I chair, released a report that found that the average price of new treatments that NIH scientists helped develop over the past 20 years is over $111,000. In other words, we are spending a fortune developing new drugs, but our people cannot afford the treatments that they pay for. In virtually every case, American taxpayers are paying far more than people in other countries for the exact same medicine that the NIH helped to develop. Now, that may make sense to somebody. It does not make sense to me. And here are just a few examples from the report. Astellas and Pfizer charge Americans with prostate cancer over $165,000 for Xtandi, while the exact same drug can be purchased in Japan for just $20,000. Guess who developed that drug? American taxpayers. Johnson & Johnson charges Americans with HIV $56,000 for Semtuza, while the exact same treatment can be purchased in the UK for just $10,000. Guess who developed that treatment? American taxpayers. Millennium Pharmaceuticals charges Americans with cancer $54,000 for Velcade, while the exact same drug can be purchased in France for just $11,000. Guess who did the research and paid for that drug? The NIH and American taxpayers. In other words, here is the insane situation. The American taxpayers fund the research for these drugs, but they can't afford the product that they helped create. Does anybody really think that makes sense? If American taxpayers help develop a drug, we should be paying the lowest prices in the world for that product, not the highest. Mr. President, that has got to change. No prescription drug, no matter how effective and life-saving it may be, is worth anything to the patient who cannot afford it. In my view, at this crisis moment for American health care, we need an NIH director who is prepared to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry and use every tool at their disposal to substantially lower the extraordinarily high cost of medicine in this country. The 1,800 well-paid lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry here in D.C., it's almost 4 lobbyists for every member of Congress, may not like it, but that is precisely what the American people want, and it is what they need. The status quo is not working. We need fundamental changes in the way that the NIH addresses the crisis of high prescription drug costs. Dr. Monica Bertagnolli is an intelligent and caring person, but she has not convinced me that she is prepared to take on the greed and power of the drug companies and the healthcare industry in general. Nor is she prepared, in my view, to fight for the transformative changes the NIH needs at this critical moment. And that is why I will be voting no on her confirmation. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Madam President, I rise in strong opposition to Senate Joint Resolution 43 that we'll be voting on today. And the reason for that is that we have got to be very clear as to what's happening in America right now. Today, while the very wealthiest people in our country are becoming much wealthier, over 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, and many are working for starvation wages and under really bad working conditions. In America today, while CEOs are making nearly 350 times as much as their average workers, tens of millions of our people in every state in this country are struggling to pay the rent, to pay for the child care they need, to pay for health care, to pay for prescription drugs, and to put food on the table. That is the reality of America today. And while that is true for people of all ages, it is especially true for our younger people who, by the way, if we don't change the nature of our economy soon, will have, for the first time in the modern history of America, a lower standard of living than their parents. Now, Madam President, if we lived in a nation with a rational set of priorities, we would not be giving more tax breaks to billionaires and large corporations, as many of my Republican colleagues want, not at a time when we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had. We would not be spending, in my view, $900 billion on the military, while the military-industrial complex makes huge profits and does cost overruns, and while the Pentagon is not even audited. What we would be doing, in fact, if we had a rational set of priorities, like a number of other countries around the world are doing, is to understand that the future of our country rests with the young people in America. That's where our future is. And once we understand that, we would be doing everything possible to make sure that every young person in this country, regardless of income, receives the best quality education that our nation can provide. That's what we would be doing if we wanted this country to succeed. Our goal must be to make sure that we have the best educated workforce in the world in a highly competitive global economy. And I would point out that that is not only important for individuals, for the young people themselves, it is vital for the future of our country. Everybody understands that if you have a poorly armed and poorly trained military, they don't win battles. Well, if you have a poorly educated population in a radically changing world economy, dependent more and more on technology, if you don't have a well-educated workforce, our economy is not going to succeed in this global economy. Madam President, in 1990, the United States led the world in terms of the percentage of young people between the ages of 25 and 34 with college degrees. We led the world in 1990. Today, we are in 15th place. Not number 1, not number 5, not number 10. We are in 15th place behind countries like South Korea, Canada, Ireland, Australia, the Netherlands, and Belgium. 15th place for the richest country on earth should not be the place we are in if we are concerned about the future of this country and the need for a well-educated population. Madam President, over 40 years ago, a federal Pell Grant paid for over 80% of tuition, fees, room and board at a four-year public college. But today, because of massive cutbacks in education, Pell Grants cover less than a third of those expenses. 40 years ago, covered 80%. Today, less than a third. And Madam President, that is a major reason why more than 45 million Americans are drowning in over $1.7 trillion in student debt. And Madam President, I'm sure it's true in Nevada, and I'm sure it's true in Vermont, and I'm sure it's true in Louisiana. We have hundreds of thousands of bright young people who have the ability to get a college degree or to get a good trade certificate, but they cannot afford to do so. How absurd is that? If we love this country and we're concerned about the future, to say to young people, you're bright, you're smart, you did well in high school, but you come from a lower income family, too bad you can't afford to go out and become a teacher or a doctor or an engineer. Too bad. I think that that is absurd. And let's be clear. We don't just need more four-year college graduates. We need more welders and electricians and plumbers and pipe fitters and carpenters and electricians. Amazingly enough, as Madam President, you well know, this Congress passed a record-breaking amount of money to rebuild our crumbling infrastructure. That's the good news. I think almost everybody is proud of that. Bad news is we don't have workers to do the work, to build the bridges, the sewer systems that we need, the water plants. We spend huge amounts of money in dealing with the existential threat of climate change. We don't have the workers to help us with solar and wind and other forms of sustainable energy. Now, in my view, and obviously I speak only for myself, not the President, in my view is if we had a rational set of priorities in this country rather than worrying about tax breaks for billionaires and for Wall Street, what we would do is make all public colleges and universities in this country tuition-free and cancel all student debt. That's what I think we should do that would be rational. You know, 100 years ago, people fought and said, you know what? It's unfair that working-class kids can't go to high school. And they're working in factories, they're working on farms, working in the fields. People fought and said, you know what? We need to make public education free. And they did it. So today, any kid in America, in any state in America, could walk into a public school, doesn't matter whether you're rich or you're poor, you get the best education that system can provide. The world has changed over 100 years. And what was good 100 years ago or 50 years ago in terms of a high school degree has changed. And we need, in my view, to make public colleges and universities tuition-free. And by the way, what we are seeing all over this country, in this state, in that state, in this city, is a movement in that direction. And I applaud all those public officials around the country whose states and cities are moving in that direction, making community colleges tuition-free, public colleges tuition-free. But, Madam President, what I would like to see happen is not what the President's plan is about, not at all. But this is what the President's plan does do. It cuts student loan payments in half for Americans who have taken out undergraduate loans. In fact, under the President's SAVE plan, student loan borrowers will be seeing their monthly payments reduced from 10% of their income down to just 5%. Further, the President's plan eliminates monthly student loan payments entirely for people who are earning less than $15 an hour. and it gives student loan borrowers the ability to wipe out or to substantially reduce their student loan debt over a 10-year period. Madam President, if Senator Cassidy's resolution is enacted, it would repeal President Biden's plan, and it would eliminate student debt relief for more than 5 million Americans who desperately need it. That would be absolutely unacceptable. Now, my Republican colleagues tell you that they want to repeal the president's student loan plan because it costs too much money. We just can't afford it. Well, I'm not going to deny that it does cost a lot of money. But what I find amusing is that when we are saying we need to help working class and lower income young people, what my Republican colleagues say, we can't afford to do that, but what we can do is vote to give away over $1 trillion in tax breaks to the top 1% large corporations when former President Trump was in office, without paying for it. No, we can't help young people with their student debt, but we can give tax breaks to the richest people in this country and large profitable corporations. So, Madam President, if we can afford to provide trillions of dollars in tax breaks and corporate welfare to the wealthiest people in this country and to the largest corporations, we can help out millions and millions of young people in this country. Because I've talked to young people who say, you know what, we can't afford to get a home of our own. We can't afford even to buy a car. We were thinking about having kids. We can't even afford to do that. So I think we have got to get our priorities right and understand that a vote for this resolution would deny student debt relief to millions of Americans across every state and across every congressional district. A vote for this resolution would place millions of Americans at risk of eventual delinquency and default on their student loans. We cannot allow that to happen. I urge my colleagues to vote against this resolution, and I yield the floor. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza today is a disaster. Congress must take action. The administration must take action. The world must take action. Today, 3 weeks after Hamas's barbaric attack against civilians in Israel, which began this war, many hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza are on the brink. Over the past 3 weeks, it is estimated that some 8,000 people in Gaza have been killed in bombings, including more than 3,000 children, and far more have been wounded. More than 1 million people in Gaza have been displaced from their homes, and some 670,000 are sheltering in UN installations where they are down to 1 liter of water per person per day. They lack sufficient food, water, medical supplies, or fuel. The hospitals and medical facilities there are in nightmarish conditions, with hundreds of babies in incubators and patients on life support at risk of death should the generators that sustain them run out of fuel. Corridors are lined with injured and displaced people, and overwhelmed doctors must turn patients away or operate without anesthesia or antibiotics. The humanitarian crisis is dire, and getting worse by the minute. There must be a humanitarian pause now so that sufficient supplies, food, water, medicine, fuel, can reach the people of Gaza. If not, thousands more will die needlessly. We cannot allow that to happen. A stop to the bombing is critical to save innocent lives and secure the safe return of hostages. Mr. President, let us never forget the lives of all children, all people are sacred, whether they are Palestinian children, Israeli children, or American children, and we must do everything we can to protect them. But, Mr. President, if we are going to make any real progress in addressing this never-ending conflict between Israel and Hamas, there have been 5 wars in the last 15 years. We need to understand somewhat as to how we got to where we are today. If peace is to come to that troubled region, and if the Palestinian people are ever going to be able to enjoy lives of security and dignity, there must be a vision of where we go in the future. So let us be clear. The living conditions in Gaza before October 7th were horrific and inhumane, and that is before Hamas ignited the latest war. Before this conflict, in Gaza, nearly 80% of people there lived in poverty, and 2/3 were reliant on humanitarian assistance. Almost half the population and over 70% of young people were unemployed in Gaza. What kind of life could they look forward to? Electricity there was intermittent, with 11 to 12-hour blackouts every day. Water and sanitation systems were inadequate, and there were constant shortages of all basic necessities. Gaza was mostly cut off from the world, with Israel and Egypt severely limiting the number of people and types of goods that could go in or out. In fact, many observers described Gaza as, quote, an open-air prison, end quote, and all of that is before October 7th. Mr. President, if we are serious about bringing freedom and dignity to the Palestinian people, that is a situation that can never be allowed to be returned to. The Palestinian people are entitled to much more than that. In Gaza, Hamas, an authoritarian terrorist organization, ruled by force, stockpiling arms and war material, taxing the desperately poor population, and stealing resources to build tunnels and rockets. Make no mistake about it, Hamas is a terrorist organization bent on the destruction of Israel, and long before this horrific attack, they had killed countless innocent people, including Americans. They advance a fundamentalist ideology which treats women as inferior, second-class citizens, and which threatens to kill people who are gay. Hamas is an authoritarian nightmare, repressing dissent and stealing from Gazans not just many materials of life, but the dream of a better future. And that was the situation before October 7th. And what was going on in Israel before Hamas's terrorist attack? What was going on there? That country had the most right-wing government in its history, a cabinet that included outright racist ministers who consistently dehumanized the Palestinian population. Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, was under indictment for a litany of corruption charges, and many believe that Israel's intelligence, or lack of intelligence, on October 7th had everything to do with his government's preoccupation with his political problems. Before the war, this right-wing Israeli government had systematically undermined the prospects of peace. Netanyahu and his extreme partners in the cabinet had worked to marginalize Palestinian voices committed to peace, pursued settlement policies designed to foreclose the possibility of a two-state solution, stymied economic development in Palestinian areas, and passed laws that entrenched systemic inequality between Jewish and Palestinian citizens of Israel. This last year saw record Israeli settlement growth in the West Bank, where more than 700,000 Israelis now live in areas the United Nations and United States agree are occupied territories. Despite that, the Israeli government authorized thousands of new homes for settlers and opened up new areas to construction while bulldozing thousands of Palestinian homes and schools and further restricting Palestinian movement. Legal experts agree these policies constituted nothing less than illegal annexation. All of these policies and more greatly increased tension in the West Bank. Before October 7th, 179 Palestinians had been killed in 2023, 179 Palestinians in the West Bank, which made it the deadliest year in 2 decades. Since October 7th, 121 more Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank, including some by settlers. These tensions were part of why so much of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, was deployed in the West Bank rather than the border with Gaza. And then came October 7th and Hamas's atrocities that began this latest and horrific war. The Hamas attack was unspeakable. Over 1,300 innocent men, women, and children in Israel were killed. Over 200 Israelis and Americans taken hostage, including young children and grandparents. Young people were gunned down in cold blood at a music festival, babies and older people brutally murdered in their homes. And let's remember that Hamas did not primarily target the military. No, they intentionally targeted civilians. Their goal was to kill civilians. Their attack was designed to provoke a response, and in that, they succeeded. Mr. President, many Israelis are now understandably furious, and they want to strike back forcefully. I think we can all understand that. But rage and revenge do not make useful policy. And here in the United States, after the attack on 9/11 in this country, we acted with rage and revenge, and I think many people now understand that that was a horrific mistake. Mr. President, killing innocent Palestinian women and children in Gaza will not bring back to life the innocent Israeli women and children who have been killed by Hamas. Like any other country, Israel has the right to defend itself and destroy Hamas terrorism. But it does not have the right to kill thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. Israel does not have the right to endanger the lives of millions of Palestinians, half of whom are children, by shutting off water, food, fuel, and electricity. That type of action against a helpless and impoverished population is morally unacceptable and in violation of international law. Israel does not have the right to bomb an entire neighborhood to target one Hamas leader or installation. But that is what the Israeli government is doing. One need only look at the satellite imagery and photography of Gaza to see that this is not a carefully calibrated campaign. These are not surgical strikes. Yesterday, Israel struck the densely populated Jabalia refugee camp and killed a Hamas commander. But they also killed some 50 other people and injured hundreds more, though the exact toll is not yet known. And that was actually the fourth airstrike on that community. An October 9th airstrike killed 60, an October 19th airstrike killed 18, an October 22nd airstrike killed 30, according to outside researchers. UNRWA reported yesterday that their head of security, that is the United Nations Relief Agency, their head of security was killed along with his wife and 8 children. In total, 67 United Nations Relief Agency workers have been killed, and 44 United Nations facilities have been damaged since October 7th. Mr. President, the current Israeli strategy must end. Israel must begin the process of restoring water and electrical services to areas where they are still operable. The international community must also rush generators and solar capacity to Gazan medical facilities to address acute needs and reduce Israeli fears of diversion to Hamas. Israel will not stop going after Hamas, but it must do it in a very, very different way, and additional pauses will be needed. Mr. President, let me conclude by saying that Israel must also begin the process of laying out a political strategy. It cannot bomb its way to a solution. Such a strategy must include, as minimum first steps, a clear promise that Palestinians displaced in the fighting will have the absolute right to safely return to their homes, a commitment to broader peace talks to advance a two-state solution in the wake of this war, an abandonment of Israeli efforts to carve up and annex the West Bank, and a commitment to work with the Palestinian Authority to build genuine governing capacity. The United States must make it clear that these are the conditions of our solidarity. Just as we want justice for the Israelis murdered by Hamas, we also want justice for the Palestinian people. And that is not going to happen with Hamas. Palestinians need a state of their own, contiguous, with the freedom of movement and access that can sustain a vibrant economy. Mr. President, this will be a long and difficult road. It will take concerted U.S. and international support and a doubling down of our political commitment to a two-state solution. But the first step right now must be to stop the bombing and bring in as much humanitarian aid as possible. And I think Secretary Blinken said it well, and he said, quote, providing immediate aid and protection for Palestinian civilians in the conflict is a necessary foundation for finding partners in Gaza who have a different vision for the future than Hamas and who are willing to help make it real. End of quote. Mr. President, this is a dreadful situation. It is part of a very, very long-term conflict between Israel and its neighbors. But the immediate crisis is to save lives, to stop the bombing, to bring forth a humanitarian pause, and then to go forward to bring peace and stability to the region. Thank you very much. I yield the floor.
Action.
Madam President, I wanted to take a few minutes to share my thoughts regarding the horrific situation in Israel and Gaza. On October 7th, Hamas terrorists waged a barbarous attack against Israel, killing over 1,400 innocent men, women, and children. Young people at a music festival were machine gunned down in cold blood. Babies and older people were brutally murdered, and over 200 Israeli and Americans are being held as hostages. Some people describe the October 7th attack on Israel as the equivalent to the 9/11 terrorist attack against the United States. That is wrong. Israel is a small country with under 10 million people. On a per capita basis, the 1,400 Israelis killed by Hamas would be the equivalent of over 40,000 Americans killed if Israel had the same size population as we do, 40,000. On 9/11, as everybody recalls, we lost 3,000 people. Madam President, let us be clear. Israel suffered a major attack and has, as do all other countries under similar circumstances, the absolute right to defend itself. But having the right to defend your country against a terrorist attack and a terrorist organization like Hamas does not mean having the right to violate international law and wage indiscriminate warfare against innocent men, women, and children in Gaza. The people of Israel have gone through a horrific and traumatic shock. It is understandable that they are furious and want to strike back forcefully. Revenge, however, is not a useful policy. Killing innocent Palestinian women and children in Gaza will not bring back to life the innocent Israeli women and children who have been killed. It will only make a terrible situation even worse and more intractable. Let us be clear. The Palestinian people today are experiencing nothing less than a humanitarian disaster. Thousands are already dead, including many children, perhaps thousands of children, and far more have been wounded. Hundreds of thousands have been forced out of their homes. These people, deeply impoverished before this war began, now lack food, water, fuel, shelter, and medicine, and other basic necessities. Unbelievably, more than 400,000 Palestinians driven from their homes are now sheltering in densely crowded UN-run schools. 400,000 people in UN-run schools. Dozens of medical facilities have been damaged and made inoperable, and 35 United Nations aid workers have been killed. The aid trickling into Gaza is just a fraction, small amount of what is needed. In a few days, hospitals will run out of fuel, and ventilators and incubators will shut off. This is a desperate desperate humanitarian crisis. I echo Senator Blinken's call for the immediate release of all hostages and for a humanitarian pause by all parties. A pause is essential for the protection of civilians as required by the laws of war, as well as for the provision of robust supplies of food, water, and medical aid to address the growing humanitarian catastrophe. I know that Senator Merkley and others are working hard to gain support here in the Senate for that position, and I agree with it. Israel suffered a terrible attack, but the response must be carefully thought through and be carried out in line with international law. When the United States was attacked on 9/11, we allowed anger and rage to drive our response. This resulted in making grave mistakes in terms of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, which cost us thousands of members of the U.S. military and, in fact, the lives of hundreds of thousands of innocent people in those countries. Israel has a right to defend itself and go after Hamas. But innocent Palestinians also have a right to life, security, and peace. Please remember that the last election held in Gaza was in 2006, when a majority of people in Gaza today were not yet born or could not vote. Even then, back in 2006, a minority voted for Hamas. Hamas is an authoritarian organization that does not necessarily represent a broad swath of the Palestinian people, and we must not conflate all Palestinians with this terrorist organization. Further, and of much concern to me and I think many others, Israel is apparently contemplating an invasion and occupation of Gaza. I have very serious concerns about what this could mean in terms of the long-term security of Israel, the well-being of the Palestinian residents of Gaza, half of whom are children, and the hope that peace, security, and justice will, at some point, come to that region. In Congress, we will soon be voting and debating a package which includes billions of dollars for Israel, above and beyond the $3.8 billion in military aid the United States sends there every year. The American people have a right to know if that money will be used to defend Israel or whether it will be used for an invasion and occupation. Israel's proposed invasion will likely bring difficult street-by-street fighting against entrenched Hamas fighters in a dense urban environment still populated by many civilians. Hamas will continue to use human shields and its extensive tunnel network and will likely resort to insurgent tactics. As two experts on this subject recently wrote, and I quote, "The battle will not end when Israel has reoccupied the territory. There is no Palestinian entity that Israel trusts to govern Gaza in Hamas's stead. As a result, a military victory could mean Israel has to administer the territory for the foreseeable future. Israeli officials, in other words, will have to govern an immiserated people who see them as their enemy and who may wage a guerrilla war," end of quote. I have serious concerns about what this invasion and potential occupation of Gaza will mean, both in terms of the long-term security of Israel and the well-being of the Palestinian residents of Gaza. In Congress, as we consider a package including billions of dollars for Israel that could fund this invasion and occupation, we clearly need much more information about Israel's long-term plans and goals, as well as the United States government's assessment of those prospects. Some of the questions that need to be answered are: how many innocent men, women, and children will be killed or wounded if Israel engages in an invasion and an occupation? How many Israeli soldiers will be killed or wounded in an operation of that kind? How will many hundreds of thousands of civilians receive the food, water, fuel, and medical care they need in the midst of what could be extremely heavy urban warfare in a very densely populated area? How long will it take to establish military control of Gaza, and what level of insurgent activity is anticipated from that point? In other words, controlling Gaza is not the end of that process. How will the success of the operation be measured? Are there alternative approaches to a ground invasion that would be effective in assuring Israel's long-term security? What will this operation mean for the hostages still being held in Gaza? What political force will administer Gaza after an Israeli operation? Will the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians who have been driven from their homes, they've been pushed out of their homes now, no place to go, will they be guaranteed safe return to their homes? Importantly, what impact will the invasion and occupation of Gaza have on the international community's support for Israel? How will the whole world feel about a powerful nation occupying a very impoverished part of the world? How will the international community address the ongoing needs in Gaza and the rest of Palestine when the shooting and bombs stop? What political process will follow this conflict, and what is the desired end state in Gaza? These are some of the questions that have to be asked. As Congress considers the administration's emergency funding request, we need answers to these questions. This is, tragically, the fifth conflict between Israel and Hamas in 15 years. Fifth war in 15 years. Clearly, a terrorist organization like Hamas cannot be the answer to the very serious problems facing the people of Gaza. Just a few months ago, thousands of people defied Hamas's authoritarian rule to protest on the streets of Gaza. They stood up with great courage against Hamas's authoritarian rule. Their voices are silenced now, but there can be no long-term solution to this ongoing crisis without a serious effort to address Palestinian demands for peace, legitimate political representation, and a vibrant economy. I would just mention one fact, and that is before this war, some 75% of the young people were unemployed. So you have, aside from everything else, an economic disaster in Gaza. And in my view, the United States must take a leading role in charting out a future that respects the lives of Palestinians and Israelis alike. We can start by answering the questions laid out above, and I very much look forward to receiving from the administration a briefing, a classified setting if necessary, in order for members of Congress to understand what an occupation and invasion will look like. So, Madam President, we are living in a horrifically difficult moment in the Middle East. And I can understand the outrage that many people in Israel feel in terms of the attack that killed 1,400 of their people. But now is the time in Israel and in the United States for us to not allow revenge and rage to dictate our policy, but to really think this issue through. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Without objection.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Senator Marshall from Kansas for his very hard work on the bill that we have introduced today, after being on the floor with me this afternoon to briefly discuss it. And I also want to thank his staff and my staff for putting in an enormous amount of time on this bill over the last several months. Mr. President, most Americans understand that our healthcare system is broken. We are spending nearly $13,000 a year per capita on healthcare. That's an astronomical sum of money, almost twice as much as most other countries. And yet, despite all of that spending, some 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, and there are estimates out there, believe it or not, that some 60,000 Americans die each year because they do not receive the health care they need when they need it. And our life expectancy as a nation is actually in decline, despite all of that spending. Frankly, as broken as our general health care system is, our primary health care system is in even worse shape. As everyone knows, I don't think there's any debate on this, we face a major shortage of doctors, nurses, mental health professionals, dentists, and those shortages will only grow as a result of the COVID burnout that many providers experienced and the aging of our healthcare workforce. According to the most recent estimates that I have seen, over the next decade, our country faces a shortage of over 120,000 doctors, including a huge number of primary care physicians. The nursing shortage may be even worse. Over the next 2 years alone, it is estimated that we will need more than 200,000 nurses. And despite the very serious mental health crisis we face, we're facing a massive shortage of mental health providers, psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, etc. Now, that is not the point that Bernie Sanders is making or Senator Marshall has made. This is the point of view of virtually every major medical organization in the country. And on this matter, let me quote from a recent Washington Post op-ed by Elizabeth Rosenthal, a contributing editor at Kaiser Family Foundation Health News. This is what she writes, quote, and I hope our colleagues hear this, quote, American physicians have been abandoning traditional primary care practice, internal and family medicine in large numbers. Those who remain are working fewer hours, and fewer medical students are choosing a field that once attracted some of the best and brightest because of its diagnostic challenges and the emotional gratification of deep relationships with patients. The percentage of U.S. doctors in adult primary care has been declining for years and is now about 25%, a tipping point beyond which many Americans won't be able to find a family doctor at all. Already, she writes, more than 100 million Americans don't have usual access to a primary care doctor, a number that has nearly doubled since 2014. I ask unanimous consent to enter the full article into the record.
Without objection.
Now, what this article points out is certainly not news to the people in America. In Vermont and all over this country, Our people often have to wait months in order to get an appointment with a doctor, and in some cases, they have to travel very long distances to get the health care they need. And let us be clear, there is no debate upon this. Some people think, well, we don't have to act on it now. Let's do it next year, following year. Wrong. The crisis is only going to get worse, and every day that we delay it, it becomes even worse. Now, why is this happening? Well, there are a lot of reasons why. But one of the reasons is that it turns out that the United States, despite all of our spending on health care, spends about half of what other nations do on primary health care. We spend approximately 7%. Most other countries spend at least twice as much. And the absurdity of that situation is that everybody knows that, quote, an ounce of prevention is worth more than a pound of cure, end quote. And if there's anything that Senator Marshall and I are talking about, that is exactly what we're talking about. If you spend money, you are spending money to save money. Keeping people healthy saves money. In other words, common sense tells us that if we can prevent disease, do a better job keeping our young people healthy, if people can access the medical care when they need it, not when they are just very, very sick, if we can do those things, we can keep them out of the hospital, and hospital costs are just extremely, extremely high. Common sense also tells us that it is literally insane that millions of Americans with non-emergency health care needs get their primary care in a hospital emergency room, which in some cases is 10 times more than the care provided them in a community health center. Let me just give you one other example of the irrationalities of our current system. In my own small state of Vermont, last year, our major hospitals spent $125 million in 1 year on traveling nurses because we don't have enough local nurses to support the needs of the hospital and many other facilities in Vermont. Meanwhile, young people want to become nurses. They're applying to nursing school, but the nursing schools don't have the faculty to educate them. I recently talked to a senator who told me that in her state, some 1,100 young people were applying for a space in nursing school. The school can only provide 80 openings. So we have a nursing crisis. We're not addressing it. Hospitals are spending 3-4 times as much money on traveling nurses as they are on homegrown nurses because we're not educating our young people at nursing schools. This may make sense to somebody. It does not make great sense to me. Mr. President, the legislation that Senator Marshall and I have introduced today does not solve by any means all of the health care crises we face. But if this legislation is passed, it will not only save us substantial sums of money, not only provide a medical home for millions more Americans, not only significantly increase the number of doctors and nurses that we desperately need, but it will go a long way toward transforming primary health care in America, something that is so long overdue. And with that, I want to turn the floor over to Senator Marshall. And I would say this, that Senator Marshall has a unique perspective on this. Not only is he a senator from a rural state, he is also a practicing physician and has an insight into the crises in health care that many of us don't. So with that, Senator Marshall, thank you very much for being with us.
Well, thank you, Senator Sanders. It's certainly an honor to be on the floor with you and with the President. Thank you so much, Mr. President, for sharing this moment with us. You know, one of my mentors here on the Hill has this saying that some senators come here to make a point and others come to make a difference. The first time Senator Sanders and I sat down together, he said, "Roger, do you want to make a difference?" We have worked so hard on this issue together, developing rapport, confidence in each other, in our staff. They've all done an incredible job as we try to get through this riddle of healthcare challenges across this great nation. I think as both of us travel back to our home states of Vermont and Kansas, what we found is not everybody has meaningful, affordable access to primary care. So we went out and tried to find the best actors. Where were the best outcomes? Who was making a dent? And I think we both discovered that our community health centers were doing a great job. They'd taken many pilot programs and they were improving them. I'm not sure what Senator Sanders would talk about some of his, but what I saw is this meeting patients where they are concept, integrating all the different elements of primary care, not just your blood pressure, not just your AccuCheck, but also your mental health, dental needs as well, are just a few more things that we're seeing being integrated into the community health centers. Nutrition coaching, something that's seldom been done in clinics before. So I think we saw these community health centers as doing a great job, and we asked each other, how can we improve upon them? And Senator Sanders and I agreed on this lofty goal that we could get more Americans into these clinics, and that was a great solution for primary care. So for the past 3 months, we've had a very thoughtful approach to this problem. And even before then, our committee has had multiple hearings with different folks as they've tried to address the problem as well. And then we've had multiple Zooms and meetings with folks back home. How do we solve this primary care problem? And again, this mental health epidemic just slapping us in the face every time we go back. And certainly, I think most of our committee would agree that the community health centers are a great solution, but they need to be bolstered and need to continue that mission across this great nation. So I'm proud of the work that we've done on the community health centers in this legislation. Again, thoughtful legislation, and our goal is to make sure that it doesn't cost the American taxpayer any more. Again, the Senator Sanders and I have both said many times, this country is spending plenty of money on health care, but maybe we need to refocus a little bit more of it to primary care. So that's what we've done with this legislation, again, with a thoughtful approach. And our goal, again, is to make sure that it's all paid for and it doesn't cost the American taxpayer anymore. I think the other big issue that we found in common with folks back home is a nursing shortage and a primary care doctor shortage. If there's one thing that this bill would do, it would turn around the nursing crisis in a matter of just 3 years. My own wife is a community college graduate nurse. 90% of the nurses in our hospitals in Kansas, especially the rural hospitals, are 2-year community college graduates. So what we've done with this legislation is bolster more money for nursing programs. And the other program, like Senator Sanders said, the other challenge is colleges cannot afford the faculty, the nursing faculty. So we have some money to help bolster that program up as well. We have young men and women standing in line for incredible jobs in healthcare, but we don't have the faculty to bring them in. So we help with scholarships, we help with the faculty. That alone will change the dynamics across America if we have more nurses who are just the glue to this healthcare system. And then the next challenge that we attack here is just a shortage of primary care doctors in so many ways as well. So the legislation addresses that. It's great steps forward. I've been very proud, again, to work with Senator Sanders and his team, finding common ground, and I think we've made incredible strides. Senator Sanders and I have talked many times about our community health centers, and I might just ask him about the successes that you're seeing in your community health centers are, and what your vision going forward that it looks like.
Well, thank you, Senator Marshall.
Senator from Vermont.
This is an issue I have worked on really since I've been in Congress. And one of the results of that, working with others, is that in my state of Vermont, I think we are leading the nation in terms of the number of people per capita who participate in the community health center program. Senator Marshall, my understanding is that in Vermont, 1 out of 3 Vermonters get their primary health care or dental care at a community health center. And one of the things that I love about community health centers is that they really are community health centers. In Vermont, they're not just for low-income people, as important as that is. They are for everybody in the community. We used to have a Supreme Court Justice of the United States of America who vacationed in Vermont. Guess where he went? To a community health center. My understanding is the governor of the state of Vermont gets his primary health care at a community health center. And that's what I love about them. And as you well know, and as you mentioned, what they do is not only provide primary health care, many of them provide dental care, which is a huge issue. Many of them provide the mental health counseling, which, as you indicated, we have a major crisis in. And they also provide lower cost prescription drugs. So what they say is that regardless of your income, you got Medicare, come on in. You got Medicaid, come on in. You got private insurance, fine. You got no health insurance, we're going to work on a sliding scale. So by expanding these community health centers all over America, we're going to provide millions of people the opportunity to get the health care they need. That is what exists in Vermont right now, and we want to see that expanded all over the country.
Mr. President.
Senator from Kansas.
Senator Sanders and I have discussed this vision of what primary care looks like in the future, and making sure that we're meeting patients where they are. Some of our community health centers back home are bringing in food bank. They're bringing in WIC programs, social services, able to do basic mammography in those units as well. We lose track of the patients is when we got to have to say, look, come back in a month for your mammogram. Instead, it's such a great thing to say, let's get it done today. But one of the biggest underserved areas of medicine is dental. And I know this is one of Senator Sanders' visions specifically in this legislation, is to address the dental crisis. As an obstetrician myself, the only known cause of preterm labor is poor dental health, caries, cavities, whatever you want to call it. That's but one. There's lots of links to having cavities and poor gum health to having heart attacks as well. It's a way under-recognized challenge for primary care. I can't tell you how many times I've been called at 10 o'clock at night, 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday with one of my OB patients that's obviously very pregnant, but she has a cavity. Now it's turned into an abscess, and I can't get her into a dentist. And I'm calling all my buddies, and again, it's Saturday, it's 10 p.m., all my buddies, the dentists are gone. So Senator Sanders, maybe you would just share a little bit about your vision on dental and how this bill impacts that.
Senator Marshall, thank you very much.
From Vermont.
Thank you very much for raising the issue of the dental crisis in America. I can tell you that in Vermont, we have a crisis. We have made progress, but we have a serious problem. The cost of dental care is very, very high. Southern part of my state, Bennington County, if you are a poor child, you probably on Medicaid, you probably can't find a dentist. So what we have done in this bill is put $3 billion one time, into capital improvements for community health centers. That's long overdue, because if you want to expand community health centers, they need money for their own expansion and infrastructure. Building a dental operatory, and that is the dental chairs and the equipment good equipment that dentists need, is a very expensive proposition. So by putting $3 billion into capital improvements, much of which I suspect will be going to those dental operatories, we're going to be able to provide communities all over this country with the ability to access dental care in a way they are not doing it today.
Mr. President, just want to continue this discussion.
Senator from Vermont.
Madam President, I listened carefully to what Senator Scott and others have said about the barbarous act committed by Hamas against innocent men, women, and children, the mowing down by machine guns of young people who were doing nothing more than attending a dance, the murder of babies. This is an horrific act precipitating a worldwide crisis, and the United States of America, all of us, condemn this act. And in my view, the state of Israel has the absolute right to defend itself against Hamas and terrorism in general. No debate on that. But what I ask my colleagues to also consider is that while we fully appreciate the horrific attack by Hamas against innocent people of Israel, I ask you also to understand that right now there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of innocent men, women, and children in Gaza who have lost their homes. They've been thrown out of their homes. They have no food, they have no water, they have no fuel. And I remind my colleagues that half of those people are children. Half of the people in Gaza are children. So yes, we are united in doing everything we can to destroy Hamas and their terrorism. But I implore you, do not take Hamas's inhumanity and brutality and terrorism against children who are 3 or 5 years old. I ask you to think for a moment. Think about it. I have a state, represent the state of Vermont, 630,000 people. 1 million people, most of them are poor. They got nothing to begin with. Before this whole business, Gaza was one of the most desperately poor places in the world. Youth unemployment, 75%. Many of their people depended on the UN for basic survival. So what I'm asking people to take a look at is to understand what our country is about. And what our country must not be involved in is making the horrific and miserable situation in Gaza even worse. Many of the families, and again, these are people thrown out of their homes. They don't know where they're going. They don't know who will accept them. They don't know if they're ever going back to their homes. And they're poor to begin with. And do we really want to deny those people aid from the UN and other agencies to feed the children, to provide water for them? Is that really what we are about? So, of course, it goes without saying that we have got to do everything that we can to make sure that not one nickel goes to the murderous Hamas organization. But at the same time, we have got to stand with the innocent women and children in Palestine who are suffering today and are facing an almost unprecedented modern humanitarian disaster. So, Madam President, today, in the midst of this crisis, U.S. and UN assistance in Gaza is aimed squarely at addressing the basic needs of the Palestinian people, including humanitarian aid and water and health programs. The U.S. and the UN go to great lengths to ensure that aid gets to the people who need it and is not diverted, as do trusted partners like Catholic Relief Services. The Israeli government itself recognizes the importance of this UN humanitarian aid and has long supported it. Today, in the midst of this horrific crisis, the United States and the international community are working to secure humanitarian access, and what media reports I have seen recently, we may be making some progress in that, so that the UN can get food and water and fuel and medicine to the 1 million or more people in Gaza who need essential supplies. That should be our focus. There are people now facing hunger. They are facing incredible desperation, and we cannot turn our backs on them. If you think this is going to be good for Israel, if you think that the suffering of the Palestinian people long term is good for Israel, I think you are sorely mistaken. The world is looking at us, and the world understands that what Hamas did was terrible, but they don't want to see our great country turn its back on innocent women and children. That, in my view, is not what this country is about. This is a tough issue. There have been 4 wars there in the last 15 years. It ain't going to be solved tomorrow. But while we do our best to support Israel and destroy Hamas, please, let us not turn our back on the suffering people in Gaza. This is not what we should be doing, not what Congress should be doing, and therefore I object.
The objection is heard. Senator from Florida.
So I hope my colleague would change his position if he just read what I said. The bill says that it doesn't say that money can't go to Gaza. It says that no funds will be authorized for the territory of Gaza until the president certifies to Congress that these funds can be spent without benefiting terrorist organizations. I don't know how anybody can disagree with that. It says that no funds are authorized for expenditure in the territory of Gaza through any United Nations entity or office unless the president can certify that it is not encouraging or teaching anti-Israel and anti-Semitic ideas and propaganda. So this doesn't say money can't go to Gaza and help Gazans. This money says the president's got to ensure that this isn't happening, and rice bags are not being full of bullets, and we're not having the PLO give money to terrorists that killed American citizens or their families. So that's all this says, is that the money cannot go for the benefit of Hamas. So if you disagree with what this says, then you're saying money can go to Hamas, because I don't know how else you can disagree with it. This is so basic.
Is that hundreds of thousands of women and children are living in desperation today. And nobody in the world can guarantee that a bottle of water may not go to somebody connected to Hamas. And if you are insistent upon that, what you're really saying is no money for Gaza. So with that, I object. Thank you very much.
Madam President, please face it.
Senators, I'm going to ask you that you direct your comments and questions to the chair. Senator from Vermont, you were recognized. Thank you. Senator from Florida, you are now recognized.
Okay. Madam President, let's just remember what we're talking about is this is not against sending money to Gaza. It's saying if we're going to send money, it cannot go for the benefit of individuals that murdered babies, raped teenage girls, shot people in their sleep. I mean, I don't know how anybody could ever support giving money to Gaza when you know it's going to go to Hamas if you're not careful. And that's exactly what this administration said. Thank you. For Vermont.
Mr. President, I call up my amendment number 1030 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report.
The senator from Vermont, Mr. Sanders, for himself and others, proposes an amendment number 1030.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes. The Senate will come to order. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes for debate, equally divided, before a vote on the Sanders Amendment 1030. The senator from Vermont.
Thank you. Mr. President, our health care system is broken. 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, and we don't even have enough doctors, nurses, or mental health providers. Unbelievably, our life expectancy is actually declining. Our child care system is dysfunctional. Millions of parents unable to find affordable sites for their kids. We have a major housing crisis. 600,000 Americans are homeless. And, oh yes, the planet is on fire, and the world we are leaving future generations will be increasingly unhealthy. But somehow, we never have enough money to address those crises. Mr. President, if we have learned anything about the COVID pandemic, where we have lost over 1 million Americans, and climate change, which is causing massive destruction throughout the world, it is that national security is not just about nuclear weapons, submarines, and fighter planes. It's about making sure that all Americans have decent health care, education, housing, and other necessities of life. I ask for 30 unanimous consent for 30 more seconds.
Without objection.
Year after year, with very little debate, we pour hundreds of billions of dollars into the military-industrial complex. This year, it's about $900 billion. While defense contractors make huge profits, while the Pentagon remains unaudited with massive waste and fraud, we now spend more than the next 10 nations combined. Enough is enough. It's time to change our national priorities, and cutting military spending by 10% is a good way to begin. Thank you.
Mr. President,
Senator from Rhode Island.
I rise in opposition to the amendment. An across-the-board cut of 10% makes no distinction between those programs that are actually vital and necessary for the defense of the country and those programs that may be subject to reduction based on an evaluation of the program. The Senator's amendment excludes the Defense Health Program, military personnel accounts, and assistance to Ukraine, but that means the actual cuts on every other function will be much greater than 10%. The other point I think should be made, he's made a very rousing description, an accurate description of some of the issues facing us domestically, but we are now involved in a existential conflict helping the Ukrainians to defend democracy. That costs money. We're in a situation where China has increased their military dramatically, and we must be prepared to react to such a change. This world is more dangerous perhaps today than at any time, and to simply walk away from adequately funding our Defense Department would be, I think, an error.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Madam President,
Senator from Vermont.
Thank you. The Senate is now debating an $886 billion defense authorization bill. And unless there are major changes to that bill, I intend to vote against it. And let me take a few minutes to explain why. I think everybody in our country knows that we face enormous crises. As a result of climate change, our planet is experiencing unprecedented and rising temperatures. Along with the rest of the world, we need to make major investments to transform our energy system away from fossil fuels and into energy efficiency and sustainable energies. If we do not do that, not only America, but China, countries all over the world, the planet that we are leaving our kids and future generations will become increasingly unhealthy and precarious. And in fact, there are some who wonder whether the planet will continue to exist in years to come unless we move aggressively on this existential threat. But it's not only climate change. Our healthcare system is broken and it is dysfunctional, not a secret. Most Americans know that. While the insurance companies and the drug companies make hundreds of billions of dollars in profit, 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured. Unbelievably, our life expectancy, which is already lower than most major countries, is declining. And today we have a massive shortage of doctors, nurses, mental health practitioners, and dentists, something that the committee that I chair, the Health Committee, is trying to address. But it is a reality today. Healthcare system broken and dysfunctional. Our educational system is teetering. While we have one of the highest rates of childhood poverty of almost any major country, millions of parents in Vermont, Nevada, all over this country are unable to find affordable and quality child care. Major, major crisis, which is only going to become worse as a result of the cliff that the child care folks are going to be experiencing in a few months. But it's not just child care. When we talk about education, we should appreciate that the number of our young people who graduate from college today is falling further and further behind other countries. In other words, we need to have the best educated country on earth in order to compete internationally, yet other countries are seeing a greater percentage of their young people graduating college. And one of the reasons is the high cost of college. And many young people do not want to go $50,000 or $100,000 in debt to get a college or graduate school degree. And today we have 45 million Americans who are struggling under the weight of student debt, something that President Biden, I, and others have been trying to deal with. But it is not only climate, it is not only health care, it is not only education. Today, all over this country, we're seeing a massive crisis in terms of low-income and affordable housing. While gentrification is causing rents to soar in many parts of our country, some 600,000 Americans are homeless a few blocks away from right here in the nation's capital, people sleeping out on the streets. And we have some 18 million people who are spending more than half of their limited incomes on housing. So that's what the country faces. We have a planetary crisis in terms of climate change. Our healthcare system is broken and dysfunctional. Our educational system is teetering. Our housing stock is totally inadequate. And these are just some of the crises facing our country. And what is very clear, I think, to the American people, to many people here in the Senate and those in the House, we're not addressing those crises. We don't have any pretense. We are not addressing those crises. Madam President, when is the last time you heard a serious debate here about how we address climate change, how we build the affordable housing, how we reform our health care system? It is not taking place. We're not addressing those issues. So that is one political reality that exists here in the nation's capital. But there is another reality, and that is the reality of the Pentagon and military spending. And that, Madam President, is a whole other story. Every year, with seemingly little regard for the strategic picture facing our country, this body, House and the Senate, vote to increase the military budget. It just happens. We don't worry about people sleeping out on the street. We don't worry about people who don't have any health care. We don't worry about people who can't afford prescription drugs. Every year, military budget, hey, more money. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are over, and tens of thousands of American troops have returned home, yet the Pentagon's budget continues to go up. Every year, despite partisan, sometimes very contentious, partisan fights on all manners of things, you name it, big fights going on, Congress somehow comes together very quietly, little debate, to vote for the one thing that they agree on, and that is more and more money for the Pentagon. And right now, despite all of the enormous needs facing working families in this country, over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. Got it? Over half of the federal discretionary budget goes to the military. Madam President, I support a strong military. People don't have to convince me why we need a strong military. But I will oppose this legislation, this defense authorization bill, for four major reasons. First, more military spending right now is unnecessary. The United States remains the world's dominant military power and is in no danger of losing that position. Alone, we account for roughly 40% of global military spending. This comes despite the end of the war in Afghanistan and despite the fact that the United States now spends more on the military than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. We spend more than the next 10 countries combined, most of whom are our allies. Last year, we spent more than 3 times what China is spending on the military and more than 10 times what Russia spent. And while this year's Defense Authorization Act would merely match the Pentagon's record-breaking request, in most recent years, Congress has seen fit to give the Department of Defense more money than it even asked for. Imagine that. For 85 million people uninsured, don't help them. People can't afford the high cost of prescription drugs, hardly doing anything on that. People sleeping out on the streets, can't do that. Kids can't afford to go to college, can't do that. But we have year after year given the Pentagon more money than they have even requested. requiring them to submit, quote-unquote, wish lists of items to Congress. In other words, tell us what more you need. The Pentagon is routinely given so much taxpayer money that it literally doesn't know what to do with all the money Congress has thrown at them. According to the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, over an 11-year period, the Pentagon returned an astonishing $128 billion in excess funds to the Treasury. In other words, we gave them so much money, they couldn't even spend it, and they have to return some of that. So that's reason number one why I oppose this legislation. Number two, the Pentagon cannot keep track of the dollars it already has, leading to massive waste, fraud, and abuse in the sprawling military-industrial complex. The Pentagon accounts for about 2/3 of all federal contracting activity, obligating more money every year than all civilian federal agencies combined. Yet the Department of Defense remains the only major federal agency that cannot pass an independent audit, more than 30 years after Congress required them to do so. So we're throwing hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars into the Pentagon. 30 years ago, Congress said, we want an audit. We want to know what's going on, a reasonable request. It's only been 30 years. We still have not gotten an independent audit. Madam President, last year, the Department of Defense was unable to account for over half of its assets, which are in excess of $3 trillion, or roughly 78% of what the entire federal government owns. The Government Accountability Office, the GAO, reports that the Department of Defense still cannot accurately track its finances or capture and post transactions to the current accounts. Each year, auditors find billions of dollars in the Pentagon's proverbial couch cushions, just money lying around that, pops up here and there. In fiscal 2022, Navy auditors found $4.4 billion in untracked inventory. Just couldn't find it, but there was $4.4 billion, while Air Force auditors identified $5.2 billion worth of variances in its general ledger. These problems are why Senator Grassley and I have again introduced our Audit the Pentagon Act with a number of co-sponsors, which would force the Pentagon to get serious about these shortcomings by reducing by 1% the budget of any DoD component that cannot pass an audit. I don't think that that is an unreasonable request. A meaningful effort to address this waste should be undertaken before Congress throws more money at the Pentagon. Yet this absolutely necessary oversight is again missing from this bill. So it doesn't matter. Next year we'll learn that tens of billions of dollars can't be accounted for. So what's the problem? In June, the GAO found that in the preceding year, one single year, DoD's largest acquisition programs had seen cost estimates rise by $37 billion. Goes on and on and on. They come up with an estimate for a weapon system, and then they say, oh, sorry, it turns out it's going to cost a lot more than we told you. This comes after decades in which we spent more than $2 trillion on ill-considered wars, in my view, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Somehow, despite this incredible record of waste and fraud, the military-industrial complex escapes meaningful scrutiny. Third point that I want to make in opposition. Much of this additional military spending will go to line the pockets of hugely profitable defense contractors. It is corporate welfare by a different name. Almost half of the Pentagon budget goes to private contractors, some of whom are exploiting their monopoly positions and the trust granted them by the United States to line their pockets. Repeated investigations by the DoD Inspector General, the GAO, and CBS News have uncovered numerous instances of contractors massively overcharging the Department of Defense, helping boost these companies' profits to nearly 40%. Profit margins to nearly 40%, and sometimes as high as over 4,000%, while costing U.S. taxpayers hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. TransDigm, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, and Raytheon are among the offenders, dramatically overcharging taxpayers while reaping enormous profits, seeing their stock prices soar, and handing out massive executive compensation packages. Just one example. Lockheed Martin received $46 billion in unclassified federal contracts last year, returned $11 billion to shareholders through dividends and stock buybacks, and paid its CEO $25 million. These companies are fully reliant on the U.S. taxpayer, yet their CEOs make over 100 times more than the Secretary of Defense and 500% more than the average newly enlisted service member. TransDigm, the company behind the over 4,000% markup on spare parts, touted $3.1 billion in profits on $5.4 billion of net sales, almost boasting to investors about just how fully it was fleecing the taxpayers. Indeed, over the past 2 decades, major defense contractors have paid billions of dollars in fines or related settlements for fraud or misconduct. Almost every major defense contractor has had to pay fines for fraud or misconduct. Just the other day, people may have seen it in the papers, the consulting firm of Booz Allen Hamilton was fined $377 million for overcharging the Defense Department. And yet these contracts never dry up. And that is why I introduced an amendment to this year's NDAA to require the Secretary of Defense to produce an updated report on defense contractor fraud. That amendment was not included in what we will be voting on. Madam President, and here's maybe the major point that I want to make. If the pandemic, the COVID pandemic, has taught us anything, and let us not forget for 1 minute that that pandemic cost us over 1 million lives, it is that national security relies on much more than just a strong military. And it's funny, as chairman of the Health Committee a couple of months ago, we had those people who are responsible for protecting this country against future pandemics before us. And the question that everybody asks them, Democrat, Republican, is, hey, are we prepared for the next pandemic that is likely to come? And without exception, the leaders of the government agencies whose job is to protect us for that next pandemic said, no, we are not prepared. And by the way, there are some right now who want to take money away for the Center for Disease Control in this particular bill. Point is that when you lose over 1 million people to a pandemic, and when the scientists tell us there's a good chance that another one may come, that's a national security issue. True security, if we're really looking at what true security is about, it means everything that we can do to improve the lives of ordinary Americans. True security is that we address the crisis of a declining life expectancy, the gap between the lifespan of the wealthy and the working class of this year is over 10 years. If you are working class in this country, you're going to die 10 years shorter than the wealthy. Is that not an issue of national security? Do we not want to make sure that all of our people, whether they're rich or poor or middle class, have the right to live full and productive and healthy lives? I think so. That's called national security. National security has to do with the issue of education for our kids. How are we secure if our young people, from childcare to graduate school, are not getting the quality of education? Madam President, there are millions of children who today in America, as we speak, are food insecure. There are days go by when they are hungry. How do we talk about national security and not talk about the crisis of childhood hunger, not to mention childhood poverty in general? How do we talk about national security when people are sleeping out on the street? How do we, in any sense of the word, talk about national security without understanding that the weather in Texas, in the Southwest, is now hitting record-breaking levels? People are dying from the heat. Oceans are getting hotter. We're looking at drought. We're looking at extreme weather disturbances in my own state. Just several weeks ago, the worst natural disaster, torrential rainfalls that we have had since 1927. That is national security, where the people get forced out of their homes because of flooding, die from heat stroke. That's called national security. This body, the Senate, could decide to have one or two fewer ballistic missile submarines, saving almost $15 billion over the next decade. And we could put that money, and we'll go a long way toward housing the homeless or feeding the 5 million children in this country who are food insecure. Instead, day after day, here in Washington, many of my colleagues tell the American people that we just don't have the money. We can't do what every other major country on earth does, guarantee health care to all people. Can't provide affordable housing, can't provide affordable child care, can't provide nutrition to kids in America who are hungry. We just can't afford to do any of those things. But come the military budget and all the lobbyists around here from the defense contractors, my God, we can't stop throwing money at them. So, Madam President, what I would say is that the time is long overdue for our country to get our national priorities right. And one small step forward would be to say no to this very bloated and wasteful military budget and start reordering our priorities so that we pay attention to the needs of the middle class and working class and low-income people rather than just defense contractors. And with that, Madam President, I yield. Madam President, there is a lot of discussion in our country about how divided we are as a people. And there is no question that on many issues that is absolutely true. But it turns out that on one of the most important matters facing the American people, Democrats, Republicans, independents, progressives, moderates, and conservatives are all united. And they are united on the need to take on the outrageous corporate greed in the pharmaceutical industry and to substantially lower the incredibly high prices we pay for prescription drugs in this country. On that issue, the American people are quite united. Today, millions of Americans are forced to make the unacceptable choice between feeding their families or buying the medicine they need to ease their pain or to stay alive. Seniors from Vermont to Alaska are forced to split their pills in half because they don't have enough money to fill their prescriptions. Nobody really knows how many people die each year because they lack the medicine that their doctors prescribe. But a 2020 study by West Health found that by the year 2030, over 100,000 Medicare recipients could die prematurely every year because they cannot afford to buy their life-saving medicine. 100,000 seniors every year. Madam President, all over this country, in every state in this country, the American people are asking some pretty simple questions. They want to know, how does it happen that in the United States we pay by far, not even close, the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs? How does that happen? Why is it, people are asking, that nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans cannot afford the prescriptions that their doctors write? Think about how crazy that is. People walk into a doctor's office to get a diagnosis. Doctor writes out a script. They can't afford to fill that prescription. They get sicker. Maybe they end up in the emergency room. Maybe they end up in the hospital. Maybe they die. People are asking, how does it happen that nearly half of all new drugs in the United States cost more than $150,000 a year? $150,000 a year. Madam President, a few years ago, I took a busload of people dealing with diabetes from Detroit, Michigan, over the Canadian border to a drugstore in Windsor, Ontario. I think the trip took us maybe 45 minutes. And there in Windsor, Canada, people on the bus, diabetics, were able to purchase the same insulin products that they bought in the United States for 1/10 the price. 45-minute trip, same product, 1/10 the price. And I'll never forget tears coming down the eyes of people who were buying that products. Couldn't believe how much money they were saving. In 1999, 24 years ago, I was a member of Congress, and I took another busload of people, this time women in northern Vermont who were suffering with breast cancer. We took them to a pharmacy in Montreal, Canada, and once again, they paid 1/10 the price for tamoxifen, a breast cancer drug that they desperately needed. So, Madam President, how does it happen that in Canada and other major countries, same exact medications manufactured by the same exact companies are sold for a fraction of the price that we pay in America? Simple question. Question Democrats, Republicans, Independents, everybody wants an answer to that. Well, the truth is that the answer to that question, in my view, is not complicated. And in fact, it can be summed up in just 3 words, and that is unacceptable corporate greed. Unacceptable corporate greed. Madam President, over the past 25 years, the pharmaceutical industry has spent $8.5 billion on lobbying. $8.5 billion on lobbying, and over $745 million on campaign contributions so that they can continue to pay, that we can continue to pay the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Incredibly, last year, drug companies hired over 1,700 lobbyists to knock on every door in the Capitol. 1,700 lobbyists, former leaders of the Democratic Party, former leaders of the Republican Party. There are 535 members of Congress. They got 1,700 lobbyists from the pharmaceutical industry. 3 lobbyists for every member of Congress. Meanwhile, as Americans die because they cannot afford the medications they need, the pharmaceutical industry makes higher profits every year than other major industries. Year after year after year, they lead the index in terms of their profits. Between the years 2000 and 2018, drug companies in this country made over $8 trillion, that's with a T, $8 trillion in profits. In fact, in 2021, just 10 pharmaceutical companies in the United States made a total of more than $102 billion in profits, up 137% from the previous year. Madam President, it is the greed that we are seeing manifests itself not just in corporate profits. It also manifests itself in the exorbitant compensation packages that the pharmaceutical industry has given to its CEOs and other top executives within the industry. And I hope that people who are listening to us this afternoon, people who can't afford to pay for their prescription drugs, hear this. And that is according to a report done by the Health, Education, Labor, Pension staff, committee staff, of which I chair, released today. In 2021, while hundreds of thousands of Americans died from COVID, 50 pharmaceutical executives in just 10 companies made $1.9 billion in total compensation. 50 executives, $1.9 billion. And these same 50 executives are in line to receive up to $2.8 billion in golden parachutes once they leave their companies. Let me give you just a few examples. AbbVie CEO Richard Gonzalez made nearly $62 million in total compensation in 1 year. The CEO of Eli Lilly, David Ricks, made more than $67 million in 1 year. Incredibly, the CEO of Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, Leonard Schleifer, made nearly $453 million in total compensation in 1 year. $453 million in 1 year. Meanwhile, Madam President, while we are told over and over again that the reason we have such high drug prices in America is because of the need of the drug companies to invest in research and development. That's what we're told over and over again. We need to charge you outrageous prices so that we can use that money to invest in research and development for new drugs. Well, it turns out that over the past decade, 14 major pharmaceutical companies spent $747 billion not to research and develop life-saving drugs, but to make their wealthy shareholders even wealthier by buying back their own stock and handing out huge dividends. It turns out, amazingly enough, or maybe not amazingly, that the drug companies spent $87 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than they spent on research and development. So when you hear about all of the need for high prices for research and development, they spent $87 billion more on stock buybacks and dividends than on research and development. Madam President, the truth is we are dealing here today not just with an economic issue in terms of the high price of prescription drugs. It's a very, very important economic issue. But we are dealing with something even more profound, and that is the moral issue. And the question I think that Americans should be asking themselves, is it morally acceptable that tens of thousands of people die each year in our country because they cannot afford the medicine their doctors prescribe, while at the same time the drug companies make billions in profits and provide their CEOs with huge compensation packages? Is it morally acceptable that at a time when the taxpayers of this country spent tens of billions a year on research and development for life-saving drugs, that many of these same taxpayers who help fund the research and development for new drugs are unable to afford those drugs. Is it morally acceptable that the business model of the pharmaceutical industry today is primarily not to create the life-saving drugs we need for cancer, Alzheimer's, heart disease, diabetes, and so many other terrible illnesses, but rather through their excessive greed to make as much money as they possibly can? Madam President, I should point out that it has not always been that way. There was once a time when the inventors of life-saving drugs were not obsessed with making huge sums of money, but were instead obsessed with ending the terrible illnesses that plagued humanity. In the 1950s, for example, there was Dr. Jonas Salk, who invented the vaccine for polio. Salk's work saved millions of lives and prevented millions more from suffering paralysis. It has been estimated that if Dr. Salk had chosen to patent the polio vaccine, he would have made billions of dollars. But he did not. When asked who owns the patent to this vaccine, this is what Dr. Salk said, quote, "Well, the people." I would say, "There is no patent. Could you patent the sun?" End of quote. What Dr. Salk understood was that the purpose of the vaccine he invented was to save lives, to make sure that as many people all over the world were able to receive it, and not to make himself obscenely rich. And Salk, among other great scientists, was not alone. In 1928, Alexander Fleming, a scientist from Scotland, discovered penicillin at St. Mary's Hospital in London. Fleming's discovery of penicillin changed the medical world and saved millions of lives. I am sure that Alexander Fleming could also have become a multi-billionaire if he chose to own the exclusive rights to this antibiotic, but he did not. When Fleming was asked about his role, he did not talk about the outrageous fortune he could have made through his discovery. Instead, he said, quote, "I did not invent penicillin, nature did that. I only discovered it by accident," end quote. And then, Madam President, there was the great scientist Frederick Banting from Canada. In 1921, Dr. Banting, along with two other scientists at the University of Toronto, invented insulin, drug we're hearing a whole lot about now. When Dr. Banting was asked why he wouldn't patent insulin and why he sold the rights to his invention for $1, he replied, quote, "Insulin does not belong to me, it belongs to the world," end of quote. Frederick Banting. It has been estimated that Dr. Banting's invention of insulin saved some 300 million lives. Once again, in Dr. Banting, we saw a great scientist make it clear that his purpose in life was to help humanity, prevent suffering, save lives, not just to make billions for himself. Meanwhile, Madam President, while Dr. Banting sold his patents for insulin for $1 so that humanity could benefit from his discovery, I should point out that Eli Lilly, one of our nation's largest drug companies, has increased the price of insulin by 1,200% over the past 27 years to $275, while it costs just $8 to manufacture. Selling it for $275 costs $8 to manufacture. Not quite the spirit of Frederick Banting. Now let's fast forward to the COVID pandemic. This horrible moment in our history where we have lost over 1 million Americans and tens of millions have suffered various levels of illness. Moderna, a drug company in Massachusetts, worked alongside the National Institute of Health to develop the vaccine that so many of our people have effectively used by millions of people effectively. It is widely acknowledged that both the company and the National Institute of Health, NIH, were responsible for the creation of this vaccine. They worked together. After the company received billions of dollars from the federal government to research, develop, and distribute the COVID vaccine, well, guess what happened? Turns out that the CEO of Moderna, Stefan Bancel, became a billionaire overnight and is now worth $5.7 billion. Further, the two co-founders of Moderna, Noubar Afeyan and Robert Langer, also became billionaires and are now both worth $2 billion each. And one of the founding investors in Moderna, Tim Springer, is worth $2.5 billion. None of them were billionaires before the taxpayers of our country funded the research and development for the COVID-19 vaccine. And collectively, these handful of people at Moderna are now worth over $11 billion. And meanwhile, Moderna as a whole made over $19 billion in profits during the pandemic. Given that reality, given the enormous amount of taxpayer support, how has the CEO of this country thanked the taxpayers of America for the huge profits that Moderna has experienced and for the incredible wealth that he and his other executives have experienced? Well, he is thanking them by proposing to quadruple the price of the COVID vaccine to about $130 once the government stockpile runs out. And let us be clear, by the way, this is a vaccine that costs just $2.85 to manufacture. Madam President, on March 22nd, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee will be holding a hearing to discuss this subject. And bottom line that we will be discussing, does Moderna think that it is appropriate to quadruple prices for the vaccine after receiving billions of dollars in taxpayer support? Madam President, while Moderna may be a poster child for contemporary corporate greed, certainly they are not alone. A number of years ago, the former CEO of Gilead became a billionaire by charging $1,000 for Sovaldi, a hepatitis C drug that was discovered by scientists at the Veterans Administration. This drug costs just $1 to manufacture and could be purchased in India for $4. The Japanese drug maker, Astellas, which made $1 billion in profits in 2021, recently raised the price of the prostate cancer drug Xtandi by more than 75% in the United States to nearly $190,000. This is a drug that was invented by federally funded scientists at UCLA and can be purchased in Canada for 1/6 the price charged in America. Taxpayers fund the development of the drug and now pay 6 times more than Canadians do for the same product. And it goes on and on and on. Madam President, there is no rational reason why the HIV treatment Biktarvy costs over $45,000 per year in the U.S., but only $7,500 in France. Or while a weekly dose of the autoimmune medicine Enbrel costs over $1,700 in the U.S., but just $300 in Canada, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Goes on and on and on. Madam President, the American people, regardless of their political affiliations, are sick and tired of being ripped off by the pharmaceutical industry. Now is the time for us to have the courage to take on the 1,700 lobbyists all over Capitol Hill, to take on the unlimited financial resources of that industry. Now is the time to stand with the American people and substantially lower prescription drug prices in our country. And the Health, Education, Labor, Pension Committee is going to be actively involved in that process. Thank you, Madam President. With that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President, I'm back again, seeking unanimous consent for the passage of my Free Bird Act. Now, previously, my request for unanimous consent was met with an objection on the grounds that we're still in the midst of a public health emergency. It was obviated. This objection, this unanimous consent request, was objected to on the grounds that if we were going to do this, we should end the vaccine requirement for foreign travelers and the public health emergency at the same time. To do this, in the words of the objector, to make it clean. Well, Mr. President, just last night, the Senate voted to terminate COVID-19 pandemic national emergency order. That makes this as clean as it gets. We've passed this now, and early this morning, the White House announced that the President will be signing that measure, which had previously been passed by the House, into law. So that's happening now. That means that this is as clean as it gets. These things would go out at the same time with a bang, as well they should. Now, it also means that there's no reason why we shouldn't end this particular restriction, the restriction on unvaccinated foreign travelers coming into the United States today. Now, to those who might think that the Senate passed something last night that might somehow make it unnecessary to pass the Free Bird Act, make it unnecessary separately to enact legislation ending the foreign traveler vaccine requirement, they're mistaken. And they're mistaken because those two legal documents, the proclamation issued by President Trump in 2020 declaring a national public health emergency, and the October 2021 executive order issued by President Biden putting in place the foreign traveler vaccine requirement, they're separate things. Neither depends on the other. And so the fact that the public health emergency executive order is now on its way out the door, it will be no more in a matter of hours or days, makes no difference as to this one. This one remains in effect unless or until it's undone. So to paraphrase the words of the member of the Senate from the Democratic Party who objected to this just a few days ago, we can make it clean. Now, we should make it clean. In fact, we should make it clean by getting rid of this just as the other expires. Now, look, so it begs the question, why does this matter so much? Why do we care about the fact that we're requiring foreign travelers to prove that they've been vaccinated prior to entering the United States? Well, we care, and we should care, because it's levying a really heavy cost on state and local economies and on the American economy and on American relationships across this country. Continuing to keep this mandate in place at a time when President Biden himself has declared that the pandemic is over and is prepared apparently to sign into law legislation passed by both houses, officially ending the order declaring the existence of the public health emergency over COVID, it doesn't make any sense to continue this, especially at a time when this body has voted and the president's prepared to sign the other measure. Look, those who oppose this really are unjustified in what they're trying to do, especially because they're ignoring the new risk calculus that is affording Americans a renewed sense of normalcy, much needed normalcy after 3 years of chaos. This policy has separated loved ones for far too long. It's time to end the COVID-19 vaccination requirement for foreign travelers, prohibit using federal funds to carry out the requirement, and prevent the CDC from ordering future COVID-19 vaccine mandates for foreign travelers. It's costing us too much. Mr. President, in 2021 alone, Utah visitors, travelers coming into Utah, spent nearly $11 billion, generating over 130,000 jobs and almost $2 billion in state and local tax revenue. Now look, Utah's tourism sector experienced so much decline during COVID, particularly during 2020. By 2021, and even more so by today, it really has recovered quite well, except in one area. We still haven't recovered, much less made any gains, with regard to foreign visitors to the state of Utah. Why? Well, I think a lot of it has to do with this unnecessary draconian requirement, a requirement that the developed world no longer recognizes the need for. We're outliers in the free world for keeping this in place. But by lifting the vaccine mandate, Utah and the United States stand to benefit tremendously from increased international travel. Look, it's not just that it's costing us tourism. It's costing us meaningful connections, connections that enrich and promote our shared humanity. Right now, foreign travelers, including family members, including friends, business relations, and even international sports figures, are being kept off of U.S. soil arbitrarily due to this draconian vaccine mandate. Look, right now, today, this very moment, we have the opportunity to reverse course. In fact, the House of Representatives has already passed this very bill ending the vaccine mandate, and it's passed it with bipartisan support. Today, we can restore our personal and business relationships, boost our tourism, not just in Utah, but across America, and re-engage in the competitive spirit that brings nations together. It's time, Mr. President, to end this mandate. It's time to join the rest of the developed and the free world. It's time to free the bird and to pass the Free Bird Act. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 14, H.R. 185. Further, that the Lee substitute amendment at the desk be considered and agreed to, that the bill as amended be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motions to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President, reserving the right to object.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I am here on behalf of Senator Sanders, who was pulled away from the floor on an important matter. He asked me to object on this matter. He gave me some documentation and some points. I don't want to burden the Senate with reading everything that I was given, but I would like to ask permission to enter into the record the objection on behalf of Mr. Sanders, if there's no objection to that, sir.
Without objection.
And I will say, I really feel so blessed to be a senator, and one of the great blessings for me has been getting to know my colleagues, and I know folks on both sides of the aisle and have sincere friendships and admiration. Senator Lee is one of the people I respect in this body the most. He's learned. I have learned from him. My positions on issues have evolved from taking the time to actually listen to my colleague from Utah speak. And he's passionately, I now see both colleagues from Utah here. I need to get Menendez down to this floor and get some firepower here. But I've also learned a lot about Utah itself. And when he talks about the reasons for getting rid of this, they're very compelling to me. The reality is tourism is one of our greatest industries. It creates jobs and opportunities. When he talks about sports teams, I'm not sure it's because he's a sports fan. I think he understands that sports teams help create economic growth and economic opportunity. And even more than that, what I've learned from my colleague and my friend is that Utah is a very special place. I remember you told me, the senator from Utah told me that I think one of the cities in Utah is one of the places in America that most foreign languages are spoken and mastered in all of our country. And I imagine because of the extensive foreign travel, there's real connections. And he said something that resonated with my spirit, which is this idea that it's affecting families, that we might have blended families. Americans do often marry people from outside of our country. All of those reasons I feel are very compelling. When I read Senator Sanders' remarks here, though, I found them compelling as well. And one of the things I found most compelling, I don't know about the senator from Utah, I actually have a science degree, a political science degree. So I tend to rely on health professionals. And the Senator Sanders' remarks, all of which I'll put in the record, talk to the point about the fact that people are still dying in the United States from COVID, but they also point that COVID didn't originate here. We know it came from another country. We know that a zoonotic disease spread from wet markets in other countries into human beings that then traveled to our nation, most likely, and spread it to us. We know that variants are still happening. Many of them can come from outside of our country, and there are many health professionals who believe that doing the right thing, ensuring people are vaccinated, may help us to stop a future variant. Now, again, there are reasonable objections on the other side on this, and my hope is that perhaps we as a body can come together and find a just way forward. We are indeed a body where a lot more happens in a bipartisan way than I think most of the public understands. And I know from my experience of 9 years in the Senate that a lot of the bipartisan legislation I've respected most, Senator Lee, especially on our Judiciary Committee, has been involved in those. So I, on behalf of Senator Sanders, am objecting because of his reasons, but I do hope to continue my personal conversations with Senator Lee on that. So officially, Mr. President, I object.
Mr. President.
Objection is heard. Senator from Utah.
If I could just respond very quickly, because I know the floor is backed up and I want to help people get back on schedule. First of all, I really appreciate the kind remarks from the senator from New Jersey, who's a dear friend. I'm a former resident of his state, and I first heard his name when I lived there about 25 years ago. I've always enjoyed working with him, and I appreciate the dignified manner in which he responded to this request today. You drew the short stick, and you've got a job to do. I get it. I do look forward to working with you on this, because I suspect you and I can get to the point where we agree on this. I would love nothing more than to add you as a co-sponsor. Look, the bottom line is I haven't reviewed what Senator Sanders has submitted through Senator Booker, but I look forward to doing that. I surmise, based on the summary, that these are relying on certain experts. Some of the same experts who have given some phenomenally bad advice, much of which turned out to be wrong. Same experts that told us that it didn't leak from a lab. Same experts that told us that it wouldn't spread among the vaccinated. Same experts that told us that we should have to mask 2-year-old children when getting on a plane. There would be no adverse consequences from sending children to school during COVID, and that it was absolutely necessary and imperative to do so. Some of the same experts who tell us to vaccinate young children, sometimes infants, with this particular vaccine. So I have great reluctance to defer to those same experts when especially considering the fact that even though some of those very same experts are telling us not to end the public health emergency, we've now done so, and President Biden's going to sign that into law. Let's end the madness of deference to experts who have proven time and time again to be wrong. Thank you, Mr. President.